Tonight it is my extreme pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Anna Lemke. Dr. Lemke received her undergraduate degree in humanities from Yale University and her medical degree from Stanford. She's currently a professor and medical director of addiction medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. She's also the program director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. I think she's busy. She is a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and a diplomat of the American Board of Addiction Medicine. Dr. Lemke has written a New York Times bestseller entitled Dopamine Nation, and that is also subtitled Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Interesting. She's going to talk to us today about neuroscience, the neuroscience of addiction, pain, pleasure, and the addictive chase for dopamine. So with that, I'm going to turn it all over to her, and I am really excited to hear what she has to tell us. Thank you very much for coming today, Dr. Lemke. It's all yours. And can you unmute yourself?
Can everybody hear me okay?
We can.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really impressed by the turnout and also the incredible international showing. How exciting that you all have built this worldwide community. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'm really hoping to have more of a dialogue. I think I have as much to learn from all of you as you might have to learn from me. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to try to condense the last 50 to 100 years of the neuroscience of addiction, pleasure, and pain into about 10 or 15 minutes. Then I'm going to talk about the ways that our ancient wiring for going toward pleasure and avoiding pain is mismatched for the modern ecosystem. And then I'm going to talk about how I think our understanding of the neuroscience can inform a better way to live in the world that we've created now, this world of overwhelming access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, and how people in long-term recovery from addiction serve as modern-day prophets, even for those of us who do not have addiction, because people in recovery have this hard-won wisdom that I think is essential to understanding how to navigate a dopamine overloaded world. So I'm going to first share some slides, because I think these visuals are kind of a way to capture the neuroscience, and I do use an extended metaphor of a balance and gremlins, but please appreciate that this is a simplification of obviously a much more complex process. But let's go ahead and start with the neuroscience. I'm going to share screen. If you can, Susie, allow me to share screen. I think you have to make me a co-host.
Yeah, Patrick's going to have to make you a co-host. Patrick, can you do that?
Sorry, I thought I did. Let me check. Maybe I made another. I'm sorry, I made Anna M. Sorry. Okay, I got it. Okay, there you go.
You're all set?
Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. Okay. So, one of the really exciting findings in neuroscience in the last 50 years or so is that there's a dedicated circuit in the brain called the reward circuit, which is fundamental to our ability to be able to approach things that are pleasurable and reinforcing, which is fundamental for our survival, and also avoid things that are painful. It's also the circuit that goes wrong in the process of addiction. And the circuit is comprised of nuclei in those deep midbrain structures, often referred to as the lizard brain or the triune brain. These are very old phylogenetically conserved nuclei, conserved across millions of years of evolution, and essentially unchanged across species, consisting of the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, where dopamine is released. And dopamine is our pleasure or our reward neurotransmitter, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. In addition to these deep midbrain structures, which is also where our limbic system is and our amygdala that you might have heard of, another nuclei essential for processing emotion. Those deep midbrain nuclei communicate with an area called the prefrontal cortex, which is the from an evolutionary perspective, a much newer part of the brain. And it's that gray matter part of the brain that sits right behind our foreheads, which is so important to the experience of delayed gratification, appreciating future consequences, and also autobiographical storytelling or storytelling in general, which, as you'll see, I think is essential to also understanding of the process of addiction and how to get out of it. So this is a fundamental circuit, and what we know is that different kinds of brain functions don't happen in isolated nuclei. They happen in specific circuits where different nuclei are talking to each other. And one way to conceptualize this circuit is that those deeper structures, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, are kind of like the accelerator on the car, and the prefrontal cortex is kind of like the brakes. And for a car to function well, we need to have an accelerator that works and a prefrontal cortex and a braking system that works. And what we think goes awry in the process of addiction is that the ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, accelerator region gets injured or is maladapted in some way. In other words, the accelerator is pressed too easily, or the brakes stop working. That is to say, the prefrontal cortex isn't able to slow down that accelerator. Key to this circuit is a very important neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine is essential for the brain's experience of reward, pleasure, and motivation. So what is a neurotransmitter? A neurotransmitter is the molecule that bridges the gap between neurons. And you'll see this here, that this gap between neurons is called the synapse. And the neurons are the workhorse cells of the brain. They conduct electrical impulses. And the neurotransmitters are a way to fine-tune the messaging between these neurons. So dopamine is, and here I'm sort of using the metaphor of a pitcher who is the presynaptic neuron throwing out the ball, which is the neurotransmitter, caught by the mitt, which is the receptor, on the postsynaptic neuron, which is the catcher. So dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in reward, motivation, and pleasure, but it's probably the most important one, and it is the final common pathway for all reinforcing drugs and behaviors. In our brain's reward pathway, there is a constant level of dopamine firing. And when something is reinforcing, what we get is a temporary increase in dopamine firing above baseline levels. And the addictive nature or quality of any substance or behavior can, in some ways, be measured by how much dopamine is released in the reward pathway and how quickly it's released. In other words, how much above baseline dopamine firing we get when we do a reinforcing drug or behavior. Some scientists speculate that dopamine is even more important for motivation than it is for pleasure. So, for example, there's a very famous experiment where rats were engineered to not have dopamine in this specific reward circuit in the brain. And what the scientists discovered is if they put food into the rat's mouth, it would eat the food and seem to get pleasure from the food. But if they put the food even a body length away, the rat would starve to death. In other words, dopamine seemed to be really fundamental to our motivation to do the work to get the reward. And in fact, my colleague, Rob Lemke, who's a very accomplished neuroscientist here at Stanford, once said to me that the way that he defines addiction in lab animals is how hard the animal is willing to work to get their reward. So the way that he quantitatively measures it, how many times are they willing to press that lever to get cocaine, for example? How much of a maze are they willing to explore before they give up? And one thing that I think is true about people with addiction is that they are willing to work very hard to get their reward. This image is from a series of experiments kind of combined together, looking at how much dopamine is released in the reward circuit of the brain in response to certain chemicals. Now, this is in rodents, rats and mice, but essentially you can see that chocolate increases dopamine firing 55% above baseline, sex 100%, nicotine 150%, cocaine 225, amphetamine. Alcohol is not on here. It's hard to know exactly where it would rank. Unfortunately, our animal models for alcohol are a little bit compromised by the fact that it's in fact very hard to get a rat addicted to alcohol for whatever reason. There are strains of rats that it's easier than others, but that's a harder one to study in rodents. But the bottom line here is that the drugs that are addictive increase dopamine above baseline. That's their common characteristic. Now, one thing that's not reflected in these data, which I think is really important to talk about, is this idea of drug of choice. And by that, I mean that what may be reinforcing for one person is not necessarily reinforcing for others. So, my drug of choice might be sex and chocolate. Your drug of choice might be alcohol, and not vice versa. And this is really important for a number of different reasons. First of all, it just acknowledges our inter-individual differences. When you think about the drug of choice concept from an evolutionary perspective, it actually makes a lot of sense that in a tribe, you would want people to have different affinities or different drugs of choice. You wouldn't want everybody going for the fermented grapes. You would want some people to be interested in chasing buffalo, and other people to be interested in chasing mates, and other people looking for grain or whatever it is, because then as a whole tribe, we have everything we need to survive. So that's a sort of an evolutionary just so story about that. But the other reason that drug of choice, I think, is an increasingly relevant concept is that we are now living in an age when there are so many more drugs to choose from, different types of traditional drugs and drugs that didn't exist before, like social media, like video games, like online gambling, like online pornography. So I do think that in terms of the increasing rates of addiction that we're seeing all over the world, in part that's accounted for, in large part, by increased access to ever more novel and potent forms of old drugs and new drugs, such that someone like me who doesn't really respond to traditional drugs is then able to find a new drug that she can then become addicted to. Dopamine is also really essential for motor function or movement. Even the most primitive nematode or worm will release dopamine in response to food in this environment. And as many of you probably know, Parkinson's disease is a problem of progressive stiffness and tremor and other irregular muscle movements that's caused by a depletion or a decrease of dopamine in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. So it's a different nucleus than the reward pathway. But it's probably no coincidence that the same neurotransmitter involved in movement is involved in reward and motivation, because for most of our existence, if we wanted to get our drug, we had to get up off the couch and go get it. That's no longer the case. And I speculate that part of the obsession that we have now with drugs is because it makes us feel something in our bodies, because there's so little left that many of us are actually doing to inhabit our bodies today. Okay, so how do we process pleasure and pain in the brain? Well, one of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located. So by that, I mean the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine that in that primitive lizard part of your brain, there's a teeter-totter like in a kid's playground. When we do something pleasurable, it tips one way, and when we do something painful, it tips the other. But there are certain rules governing this balance. And the first rule is that the balance wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And our brains will work very hard to preserve a level balance or go back to a neutral state after any deviation from neutrality. So for example, when we do something pleasurable or reinforcing, we release dopamine in the reward pathway, the balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brain adapts to the increased dopamine by essentially first tipping an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. Now, this is really important. And I like to think of this as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as the balance is level. They stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's called the come down, the after effect, the hangover, or the dopamine deficit state. So the key piece here, which is really fundamental to understanding compulsive overconsumption and addiction, is to recognize that for every pleasure, we pay a price. And that price is the come down or the dopamine deficit state. That's actually where our brain adapts to that increased dopamine by temporarily decreasing dopamine levels, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline levels before going back to level dopamine firing. So we pay a price for every pleasure. It may just be outside of conscious awareness, or it may be a more full-blown experience of a come down or hangover, but it's temporary. And if we wait long enough, those gremlins hop off and homeostasis is restored. But of course, the natural inclination when we're in that dopamine deficit state is to want to reach for more of our drug, because that dopamine deficit state is very, very painful. And in a world in which we have nearly infinite access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, it's easier and easier to do that, which brings us to the second rule of the balance. And the second rule of the balance is, with repeated exposure to the same or similar reinforcing substance, that initial deviation to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. In other words, once created, those gremlins never go away. They're hiding out in the wings, eager to hop on again. And as we use our drug repeatedly, we get more and more gremlins. And eventually we end up in a dopamine deficit state. And once that's happened, we've changed our hedonic or our joy set point. And those gremlins are camped out on the pain side of the balance. Now we need our drug not to get high and feel good, but just to return to homeostasis and feel normal. And when we're not using our drug, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use or craving. And this, for me, really helps to explain why people will relapse even many weeks after they've stopped using and their lives have objectively gotten better. It's because their dopamine reward pathway still hasn't reasserted homeostasis or a level balance. And so every day is a kind of state of craving. This is an imaging study that was done by Nora Volkoff of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. It's a very famous, now seminal study. And it speaks to this dopamine deficit state once we stop using. And I'll just walk you through it here. So here, red represents healthy dopamine transmission. And the absence of red, or these other colors, represents that there's not enough dopamine transmission. And what they did was the scientists in this study, they took a bunch of healthy controls who did not have addiction, and they looked at the levels of dopamine transmission in the specific reward a pathway part of the brain. And what you see here is a nice amount of red. This person in particular seems to have quite a lot of red in their reward pathway. In other words, they have a pleasure-pain balance that is in equilibrium, level with the ground. They're at baseline healthy levels of dopamine firing. These are individuals who had been using these various substances, cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, heroin, in an addictive way for a long enough period of time that they, that they reset their brain pathway. And these images were taken, and this is really important, 2 weeks after these individuals stopped using. And what you'll see here is that there's little or no dopamine transmission in the reward pathway. In other words, these individuals are still in this dopamine deficit state 2 weeks after stopping using, which means that they're in a state of pain and psychological a craving. So I think this is really, really important, that captures this idea of homeostasis, or the lack thereof, that happens with repeated use once we get to that place where we've changed our hedonic set point and we've got lots of gremlins camped out on the pain side of the balance. Okay, so this brings us then to the third rule of the balance. We've talked about the first rule, which is this opponent process mechanism: for every pleasure, pay a price. That's the come down before going back to the level balance. The second rule of the balance is that with repeated exposures, that initial response to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but the after response gets stronger and longer, and then we can end up in this dopamine deficit state. And the third rule of the balance is that the balance remembers. So once those gremlins are created, they never go away. We have this incredibly long-lasting memory for both pleasurable stimuli and painful stimuli. And what you can see here is an image that captures a series of experiments in which rats were trained to know that, number one, if they would press the lever or a button, they would receive an injection of a reinforcing drug like cocaine. And then they were trained to learn, essentially, that if they saw a light, then they knew if they went and pressed the lever, did the work to get it, that cocaine would be available. So it was only when they saw the light that the cocaine was available. And then the scientists went ahead and measured dopamine firing levels in the reward pathway of the brain. And what you'll see here is that, if these are roughly baseline levels of dopamine firing here at the beginning, that when the rat pressed the button or the lever for cocaine, there was a huge increase, relatively speaking, in dopamine release. And that's, of course, what we know now and what we would expect, that when we get our drug, we get a release of dopamine in the reward pathway, and that is what feels good. Our balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But the very interesting finding here was that there was an increase of dopamine, not just with the drug itself, but with the cue or the reminder of the drug. So just seeing the light and knowing that the light presaged that the drug would be available increased dopamine levels in the rodent. In other words, made the rodent a little bit high. But here's a really key piece. Right after that little increase in dopamine levels, dopamine firing went down, not to baseline, but actually below baseline. And to me, this is really powerful, because this dopamine deficit state is the state of craving, which once we enter, it's very hard to resist the physiologic pull to then do the work to go and get our drug and ingest it. Which brings us to, one of the main intervention strategies that I talk about with my patients is what I call self-binding strategies, where we have to create a world within a world, especially in a reward saturated world, where we insulate ourselves not just from our drug of choice, but also from these many triggers that will put us in this kind of mini dopamine deficit state that will then drive the physiologic craving, sometimes out of conscious awareness, to go and, do the work to get our drug. So we have to, prevent this from happening if we want to prevent this from happening. And of course, this is age-old wisdom, people, places, and things that the movement of Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step groups has figured out through their collective experience. over 100 years. But it's really interesting to me to see how the neuroscience is now mirroring that sort of collective wisdom of Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step groups. Also, interestingly, the experimenters, once the animal was taught to know that the light would predict the availability of reward, but then they took the reward away. Look what happens here to dopamine levels. So the animal sees the light, says, oh, I can get my reward, has a little bit of a hit from that, then goes into this dopamine deficit state craving, then does the work and is anticipating the reward, and a slow increase in dopamine with that anticipation of the reward. And then lo and behold, no reward. And look at this dopamine deficit to say, look how low that goes. I think there are a couple interesting potential analogies here to the human experience. One is that sense of once we've built up tolerance to our drug and we're anticipating how it's going to make us feel, but then we use it and we don't get that feeling we're looking for, the consequences are enormous because it's not just a neutral feeling. It's, again, we go into this very severe dopamine deficit state, which then drives us to use more and more potent forms to try to get back to homeostasis and reset the balance. And I think also this helps us understand or analogize what's happening on social media as people are posting things, getting a response from the world, getting that hit of dopamine, and then, of course, wanting to repeat that, posting again, and now getting no response or getting maybe a negative response, plunging into this dopamine deficit state, which then drives this compulsive persistence in order to kind of achieve this. And this kind of gets the whole idea of social media and online tech as a kind of a slot machine, and that it's the uncertainty of the reward that actually drives the compulsive behavior. So there are some interesting experiments looking at addicted gamblers and comparing dopamine release in the brains of addicted gamblers as they're gambling versus dopamine release in the brains of healthy controls as they're gambling. And not surprisingly, when they're winning, both addicted gamblers and healthy controls release dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. But the big difference comes out when they're losing. When healthy controls are losing, they're not getting any dopamine in the reward pathway. But when addicted gamblers are losing, they're actually still getting a little bit of increased dopamine in the reward pathway. And in fact, the greatest release of dopamine in addicted gamblers is when the odds of winning and losing are equal. So at the point of maximal uncertainty is actually where addicted gamblers anyway will be most reinforced and engaged. And in conversation with addicted gamblers, what I often hear is it's not about winning the money, it's about being in the trance-like state of gambling and even wanting to lose so that I can be in that trance. I have a justification to be in that trance-like state for longer. Okay, so you've heard about the 3 rules of the balance, and this gets to another aspect of the balance, which you might have deduced on your own, but which I want to validate and verify for you as being true, which is that those gremlins are in essence agnostic to the initial stimulus. So if we first press on the pleasure side of the balance with our drug, the gremlins will hop on the pain side of the balance and will eventually reset our hedonic or joy set point to the side of pain. But if we make that initial stimulus pain, if we press on the pain side of the balance, for example, with exercise or ice cold water, just as 2 examples, those gremlins will in fact hop on the pleasure side of the balance and tip us to the side of pleasure as a way to counteract that initial painful stimulus. And this has really profound implications for how we can get our dopamine in a potentially healthier and more adaptive way. That is to say, if we get our dopamine from intoxicants directly, we're going to have to pay afterward by going into this dopamine deficit state and with repetition eventually end up in a chronic dopamine deficit state, which is addiction. But if we pay up front for our dopamine by doing things that are hard, what happens is that our brain actually physiologically responds to that challenge or that injury by upregulating our own feel-good hormones and neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. And so that with repetition, we can reset our pleasure pain set point to the side of pleasure. There are loads of experiments showing that when people exercise, and by the way, exercise is immediately toxic to cells. Most people don't know that, but we know exercise is good for us. So why is that? It's through the science of hormesis, which shows that exposing ourselves to mild to moderate toxic or noxious stimuli is actually good for us because it triggers our own re-regulating mechanisms. And the experiments show that when people engage in exercise, gradually over the latter half of the exercise, there's a slow increase in dopamine levels, which then remain elevated for hours afterwards before coming down to baseline levels. Contrast that with intoxicants, where we get a sudden spike in dopamine, followed by dopamine deficit state below baseline, very painful, urge to repeat, and then eventually, hopefully going back to baseline, unless we've already reset our hedonic pathways. So this is really important because what it means is that, if we feel that we need that dopamine in our lives, and let's face it, we're wired over millions of years of evolution and across species to approach pleasure and avoid pain. One of the healthy adaptive ways that we can get our dopamine is by doing things that are painful or hard. Exercise, ice cold water bath, but also any kind of mind-body work, intermittent fasting. And this is a little bit at odds with some of the AA teachings. I've had patients who have been longtime AAers who said, well, I was taught about HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, to avoid those things because those things would set off craving. And to some extent, it's true. So we're talking. I use the word pain broadly, but we're talking about the right dose of the right type of pain. And I think what we're really talking about is an embodied, experience that's not too much. Because like with all of this hormesis, if the stimulus is too much, the organism dies. But if we can get that sweet spot where the painful stimulus is not too much, many animal and human studies have shown that it's actually beneficial to us. Big caveat here is it is possible to get addicted to pain. So for example, I treat cutters, people who cut themselves to get that endorphin rush. I've treated patients who get addicted to exercise, who keep running on stress fractures, they can't stop. Combined with some kind of eating disorder. As I talk about in my book, even had a patient who wondered if he was getting addicted to ice cold water. He kept upping the ante. First, it was a bathtub with ice in it. Then he got a professional meat cooler. Then he put a motor in the meat cooler to keep it circulating as he was going around. Then he added a cooling mattress. So on and on. It's certainly possible to get addicted to just about anything. But using these kinds of challenges, especially in this day and age where we're just saturated with dopamine, is really a good thing to do. This is a series of brain images reflecting how our brain develops over time. And what you'll see here, so in this image, the red is not representing dopamine, so it's different from the last one. The red is representing the number of neurons we have. And as you can see here in early childhood, we have more neurons than we're ever going to have in the rest of our lives. And then this crucial period of development through adolescence up to about age 25, actually, what we do is we slowly prune back on the neurons that we are not using habitually, and then we myelinate or grease the neurons that we use a lot. And in this image, the blue represents myelination, which is a sheath that's put on those long axons and dendrites to make those the electrical conduction more efficient. So the reason I show this is just to emphasize how important it is that we build healthy and adaptive habits early on, and how potentially when we're engaging in maladaptive addictive behaviors, in our adolescence, it's potentially that much more difficult because that's this process of pruning. Now, I don't want to leave you with a message that people can't get better. The brain remains plastic throughout our lifetimes, which means that we can still change. And in fact, this is also one of the exciting findings. in neuroscience in the past 75 years is that we used to believe that you were born with all the neurons you would ever have, and then they got pruned away, and then that was it, done deal. But now we know that neurogenesis, or the creation of new neurons, occurs throughout our lifespan. And in fact, one of the best ways to instigate neurogenesis is exercise and freezing temperatures, or at least that's what we've seen in animals. But certainly we have plenty of plasticity throughout our lives. And of course, I've seen people get into miraculous recovery even very late in life. So this is not to leave you with a sense of hopelessness, but just to sort of emphasize basic brain development. This is a kind of acronym that we use in our clinic here as a kind of first pass. I can talk more about that if you're interested. But ultimately, what this is kind of neuroscience-informed way of practicing psychotherapy or our own wellness, keeping the pleasure-pain balance in mind and trying to achieve a healthy, supple, balanced pleasure-pain balance so that we can be responsive to good things, mild and modest rewards in our environment, and also sensitive to dangers, because that's really what this balance was intended for. It was not intended for the world in which we live today, where we have this incredible access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors. And one of the things that I hypothesize, in my book, Dopamine Nation, is that the rising rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide all over the world, which you can see clearly in the epidemiologic and survey data for the past 30 to 50 years, which, by the way, the greatest rates, they're the highest rates and the highest prevalence of anxiety, depression, and suicide and addiction occur in the wealthiest nations. And so I think that, when we think about why are we so much more depressed and anxious and addicted, I think one of the big reasons is that we have created this world that we're really not adapted for. This is really a mismatch between our primitive wiring and the modern ecosystem, that our pleasure-pain balance, which seems like a cruel trick of nature, right? That every pleasure is followed by a pain, but it's actually a perfect design for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. It's unfortunately a terrible design in a world where at the touch of a fingertip, we can have these highly potent, highly reinforcing pleasures. In our world, what makes things so much more addictive? Access. So we have 24 access, 7 access with our phones. Quantity, TikTok never runs out. Potency, fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. And also novelty, right? So dopamine is very, very responsive to newness. So we can take an old drug and then change one little thing about it. And all of a sudden we've got dopamine firing again. So I do think that, I believe that a big reason for our growing unhappiness is not because, not necessarily because of things like trauma, although that can play a role, but really because in some ways our lives are not hard enough.